It's an honor, Sir Bobby.
The honor is ours. Welcome back.
Thank you.
The janitor had cleaned that stadium floor for 30 years. He had seen champions lift trophies, fans cry tears of joy, and legends walk those halls. But on his very last day, nobody came to say goodbye. Nobody except one person. And when Cristiano Ronaldo walked through that door, the old man's hands started shaking, because what Ronaldo was holding was something he never, ever expected. His name was George Almeida. He was 67 years old. He had a bad knee that clicked every time he climbed the stairs, a gray mustache he had worn since 1987, and a work ID card so old and worn that the photo on it barely looked like him anymore. He kept that card in the front pocket of his uniform every single day, right next to a small photograph of his wife and his 2 daughters, taken sometime in the early 90s. The photograph had been folded and unfolded so many times that the crease marks ran like rivers across their faces. Oh, but he carried it anyway. He always carried it. George started working at the Santiago Bernabeu Stadium in the spring of 1993. He was 37 years old at the time, recently arrived from Portugal, with nothing but a small suitcase, a letter of recommendation from a cousin, and an absolute refusal to give up. He did not speak much Spanish when he first arrived. He learned what he needed to learn by listening, by watching, by staying later than everyone else and arriving earlier than anyone thought necessary. The stadium became his second home before it became anything else. Some people said it in a romantic way, the way people talk about passion and devotion. For George, it was just the truth. He spent more hours inside those walls than he ever spent inside his own apartment. His job was simple on paper: clean the corridors, mop the floors, keep the locker rooms presentable, take out the trash. I'd wipe down the benches, make sure the hallways that connected the field to the rest of the world were always clean, always ready, always invisible in the way that good maintenance always is. When something is done right, nobody notices. That was the job. That was the whole point. And George was extraordinarily good at being invisible. Over 30 years, he watched the stadium fill and empty thousands of times. He watched players come and go. He watched managers arrive with big dreams and leave with packed boxes. He watched the grass get replaced, the seats get upgraded, the scoreboards go from simple numbers to massive screens that lit up the entire night sky. He watched the city of Madrid change around the stadium like water reshaping a riverbank, slow and certain and unstoppable. And through all of it, he showed up. Every morning, same time, same entrance, same greeting to the security guard at the side door. Oh, a man named Fernando, who had worked there almost as long as George himself. There were things about that stadium that George knew which nobody else on earth knew. He knew which drain in the third-floor corridor backed up whenever it rained heavily in October. He knew that the fourth locker room on the left had a light fixture that buzzed faintly at a certain time of day, when the electricity in that wing was running at full capacity. He knew that the players' tunnel had a cold draft that came from a ventilation gap behind the east wall, and that certain players would stand in exactly that spot before big matches because the cold air helped them focus. He had never told anyone these things. Nobody had ever asked. He had seen Cristiano Ronaldo arrive at that stadium for the first time back in the summer of 2009. George remembered it clearly. Not because he was starstruck, though the whole city was, but because of something small and almost entirely forgettable that happened in the tunnel that day. It was before any of the official ceremonies, before the cameras and the crowds and the press conferences. George was mopping the floor of the tunnel when Ronaldo came walking through on his way to see the facilities for the first time. Their eyes met for a second. George stepped to the side to let him pass, and Ronaldo stopped, looked at the mop, looked at George, and said, in English, because his Spanish was still new, "Thank you for keeping this place so clean." Then he walked on. It was nothing. It was the kind of small thing that most people say and immediately forget. But George did not forget it. Not because he was a man who collected compliments or held on to them for warmth. He was not that kind of man. He forgot it for a while, in fact, and then he remembered it years later, in the way you sometimes remember things that were never important until suddenly they are. He remembered the tone of it, the way Ronaldo had actually stopped, actually looked at him, actually meant it in the way that most people who say things like that do not actually mean them. The years passed. George kept working. His knee got worse. His daughters grew up and moved to different cities. His wife, Maria, developed a heart condition that required careful management and regular medication that was not cheap. George worked overtime when he could, as he picked up extra shifts during big tournament weeks when the stadium was open late and needed additional staff. He never complained about it. Complaining was not something George did, at least not out loud, at least not in any way that anyone else could hear. Cristiano Ronaldo left Real Madrid in the summer of 2018 and went to Juventus. George watched the farewell press conference on a small television in the break room, eating a sandwich he had brought from home, and he did not feel particularly emotional about it. Players left. That was the nature of football. The stadium was always bigger than any single person inside it. That was something George had understood from the very beginning. But Ronaldo came back to Madrid sometimes, for matches, for events, for the kinds of occasions that pull great players back to the places where they made their names. And the stadium always felt a certain way when he was there. Not just the fans, the whole building, all the energy of it. The way the air seemed to carry a different kind of charge. It was during one of these visits, about 8 months before George's scheduled retirement date, that something happened which George did not know about and would not know about until much later. A young woman who worked in the club's communications department had been putting together an internal video project. It was a quiet thing, a documentation of the people who worked behind the scenes at the stadium, all the ones who never appeared in highlight reels or match programs or social media posts. She had interviewed George for about 20 minutes one afternoon in November. She asked him about his years at the stadium, about his family, about what it meant to him to have spent so much of his life in one place. George answered her questions carefully, the way he did everything, without drama, without exaggeration, just honestly. He told her about the drain in the third-floor corridor. He told her about the cold draft in the tunnel. He told her about the photograph of his wife and daughters that he carried in his front pocket every single day. He told her that he was retiring in the spring and that he was not entirely sure what he was going to do with himself afterward because he had never really figured out who he was when he was not at the stadium. The young woman thanked him and went back to her desk. George went back to work. He assumed the footage would end up in some internal archive somewhere, watched by nobody, forgotten immediately, which was fine. That was how things went for people like him. That was the arrangement. What George did not know was that the young woman had shown a short clip of that interview to her supervisor, who had shown it to his supervisor, and that somewhere along the chain of people who watched it, someone decided to send it to Cristiano Ronaldo. Not officially, not through any formal channel. Just a quiet message with a video file attached, sent to someone who knew someone who had a way of reaching him directly. Ronaldo watched it on a Tuesday evening. He watched it twice. Then he made a phone call. George's retirement date was April 14th, a Thursday. The club had organized a small gathering in one of the conference rooms on the administrative floor. Cake, a card signed by about 40 people, a framed photograph of the stadium, a speech from one of the operations managers who had only worked there for 3 years and who stumbled slightly over George's last name. It was nice. It was appropriate. It was exactly the kind of thing that gets organized for a person like George by people who respect him without quite knowing him. George smiled through all of it and meant the smile, even if what was underneath the smile was more complicated than smiling. After the gathering, George went back to do one final walk-through of the stadium. This was not required of him. Nobody had asked him to do it. He just wanted to do it. He wanted to walk those corridors one last time, the way he had walked them every day for 30 years, with the lights low and the building quiet, and the smell of the place surrounding him like something he could not name, but had always recognized. He started on the 3rd floor. He walked past the drain that backed up in October. He ran his hand along the wall of the 4th locker room and listened for the faint buzz of the light fixture. He walked down to the tunnel and stood in the cold draft behind the east wall and felt it on the back of his neck for what he understood was probably the last time. And then he heard footsteps. He turned around, and Cristiano Ronaldo was standing at the entrance to the tunnel. Not in training gear, not in a suit, just in regular clothes, a dark jacket, a simple shirt. He looked like a man who had not come for any official reason, which was exactly what he was. George did not say anything for a moment. He was not sure what was happening. He thought for a second that maybe he was more tired than he realized, that the emotion of the day was doing something to his perception. But Ronaldo was real. He was there. He walked forward and extended his hand, and George shook it, and his own hand was shaking slightly, which he noticed and could not stop. Ronaldo said he had seen the video. He said he was sorry it had taken him this long to come. He said 30 years was not something that deserved a cake and a framed photograph. He said he wanted to give George something, and he reached into the bag he was carrying and he brought out a jersey. Not a new one, not a replica. The actual match jersey from the 2014 Champions League final, the night Real Madrid won their 10th European Cup, the night the entire city lost its mind with joy. Ronaldo's number 7 was on the back. His signature was across the front, and underneath the signature, written in careful letters, were the words, "To George, who kept the house while we played in it." George looked at the jersey for a long time without speaking. Then Ronaldo told him something else. He told him that he had spoken to the club, and that from that day forward, the corridor on the third floor, the one George had cleaned more than any other, the one with the drain that backed up in October, would carry a small plaque on the wall with George's name on it. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would interrupt the flow of the building. Just a name, just an acknowledgement that a person had been there, had mattered, had given something real to the place. George looked at the jersey. He looked at Ronaldo. He thought about the photograph in his pocket, his wife and daughters with the crease marks running across their faces. He thought about 30 years of mornings. He thought about the card in his front pocket, worn down to almost nothing, and how he had carried it every single day because he believed that where you worked said something about who you were. And he had always been proud of where he worked even when nobody was looking at him. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried easily. But his voice, when he finally spoke, was not entirely steady. And he did not try to pretend that it was. Oh, he said thank you. And he meant it the way that thank you almost never means anything at all, when it means everything. Ronaldo stayed for almost an hour. They sat in the tunnel in the cold draft from behind the east wall, and Ronaldo asked George about his life, about Maria's heart condition, about his daughters and where they had ended up, about what 30 years in one place does to a person, whether it makes you smaller or larger, whether you become the place or the place becomes you. Now, George answered all of it carefully and honestly, the way he always answered everything. And Ronaldo listened the way very few people had ever listened to George in his entire life, without looking at a phone, without glancing at a door, without giving any sign at all that he was somewhere else in his mind. When Ronaldo finally stood up to leave, he shook George's hand again, and he held it for a moment longer than a handshake usually lasts. He said he hoped George would enjoy what came next. He said the stadium was going to be a little less right without him in it, even if nobody would be able to say exactly why. Then he walked back out through the tunnel and was gone. George stood alone in the corridor for a while after that. He held the jersey carefully, the way you hold something you are not entirely sure is real yet. He looked down the length of the tunnel at the rectangle of field visible at the far end, the grass lit pale under the stadium lights, absolutely still and absolutely perfect. He thought about the first morning he had ever walked in here, the way the size of the place had hit him, the ceilings and the distances, and the sense that everything was built to a scale larger than ordinary life. He had been 37 years old, with a bad leg, and a letter from a cousin, and an absolute refusal to give up. He had not known then what 30 years of showing up would add up to. He was not entirely sure he knew now, but he knew it had added up to something. He knew that much. He knew it had mattered, even on all the mornings when mattering was invisible, even on all the days when the only proof was the clean floor and the empty trash and the quiet hum of a building that was ready for whatever came next. There are things that happen in famous places that never make it into the record books. There are names that never appear on any wall, any banner, any official document of achievement. There are people who give 30 years of their lives to a building and receive in return the quiet satisfaction of work done well, which is its own kind of reward, real and honest, but incomplete in a way that is hard to describe and easy to feel. George had known this for a long time. He had made his peace with it, or something close enough to peace that he had stopped examining the difference. And then, in the span of a single hour on a Thursday evening in April, something shifted in a way that could not be undone. Not because of the jersey, though the jersey was extraordinary. Not because of the plaque, though the plaque meant more than George would ever be able to fully explain to anyone. But because someone had looked at him, had actually looked, had sat in a cold draft in a stadium tunnel and asked him questions and listened to the answers with the full and genuine weight of their attention. That was the thing that stayed with George afterward, longer than anything else. Not the gift, the looking. He folded the jersey as carefully as he had ever folded anything in his life. He put it under his arm. He straightened his uniform one last time, out of pure habit. And then George Almeida walked out of the Santiago Bernabeu Stadium for the final time, through the side entrance, past Fernando at the security desk, out into the Madrid evening where the air was warm and the city was loud and the world was going on the way it always goes on. Indifferent and enormous and completely unaware that something small and important and true had just happened inside those walls.